All right, welcome back. I'm subbing for Pastor Hathaway this morning, and he has given me the Phoenicians. But just to, I'm not actually going to spend a whole lot of time on the Phoenicians. They're not necessarily all that exciting. But there's two things that I want to do. First, I want to back up and remind you a bit about the background of what this is, what we are doing here, and what you can learn from not just the information about the groups, but indeed what it is that's going on in the scriptures as we read of them and are confronted with them. First off, I want to remind you of where the Fertile Crescent is, the land of Mesopotamia. The word actually means between two rivers, and that would be the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And you see that the Euphrates runs all the way from the north in Turkey all the way down through this whole area until it dumps into the sea. And so that made this area particularly rich for planting and for crops and for animals. And you'll notice that green area also went down on the west side of the mountain range in modern-day Lebanon and now into Canaan. And there was a small area of land bridge of the Sinai Peninsula that went into the region of Egypt. And of course, if you know anything about Egypt, you know they survived on the Nile. Water is a very important aspect to ancient Near East peoples, and so that it kind of explains that. Like today, the area below Saudi Arabia was desert and wilderness and not conducive to population growth, and that was significant. You might have a few peoples who would dare to live out there, maybe hermit types who didn't want to be bothered or didn't want to be threatened by other people, but for the most part, the people groups that we're talking about all settled in this area of Mesopotamia. Right up here is the mount on which the ark is to have settled, Mount Ararat. And so you remember your story from Genesis 10 and 11 that when the flood subsided and the ark settled, that the various groups scattered out from there, and those that stayed close settled in the west, and those who didn't went east, went south and east. And so as a result of the richness of the land and the access to water, both of which are important, many towns, many little cities began eventually to crop up in that area of Mesopotamia. So that's why there is so much for us to study. Just to remind you, Genesis 11, Nimrod building the Tower of Babel was one of the first enslavers of people groups of his day and forced them into labor to build to them a tower. And you remember that God cursed that, changed their languages so that it brought confusion, and it was the confusion in languages that developed differences in cultures. When your family, it's just, when you grow up with siblings and they all seem to understand the same thing, and then you go off and you marry somebody else and you move away, you establish your own culture. You establish your own routines for Christmas. Your own routines for Easter. Your own routines for this, that, and the other. And you don't even notice that perhaps until you get back in with other family members. Well, it's the same way with these people groups. They kind of branched off and scattered from each other, and then developed their own cultures and their own accents. But there is a great deal of similarity. They're all of the Semitic people groups. You remember that Shem was the one who fathered that, and so lots of these groups are descending from that. So even if their languages are different, they all can trace back to a Semitic root. And so the growth in the cities along the entire Fertile Crescent began to grow up slowly during the whole couple of millennium that we're talking about in this period, they all came from the same background, same basic sense of relationships, and and as a result of that, in rejecting God, which is how some historians put their travel east, is they're rejecting God. As a result of that, they all came up with their anti-gods. And so each one of these groups have their own pantheon, they have their own labels for the gods that they apply to their own cultures. There would be differences in cult practices, there would be differences in understanding of who the gods are, but the point is that they would all reflect a worldview that is rejecting Yahweh, rejecting righteousness, rejecting seeking a Savior. And when you do that, even though you come up with your own idols of different names and figures, that impulse is still there. To hate God, that's the first thing you do. And the second thing you do is you come up with a substitute. And so all of these groups had that very same kind of thing. And as leaders rise up in these different groups and they seek control, like Nimrod did, then they will change those cults. They will change those I don't know where that's coming from. Okay, they'll change those idols to suit them and to reflect the power that those individual leaders may want to have. So why are the Israelites unique? If they're just Semitics like everybody else, why are they unique? Why do they stand out? Why do we have such an amazing record of the history of the Israelites? And of course, the only answer is that God calls them, and God sets them apart. You remember Genesis 11 when God calls to Abram. He's just another God, idol-fearing, idol-worshiping pagan like everybody else. His dad was that way. He's called away from that. That's the most significant thing in Genesis 11 that we read, is that Abram is called away from his father and his father's idols. And he is chosen by God to be given revelation and a relationship with God, and that makes him very distinctly different going forward than anybody else in the region. Otherwise, they're much in common. He has the same human tendencies and characteristics. He's a sinner, now saved by faith, by grace through faith, but he still is not any. He's not any different. He can't say, "Well, I'm better than you are." One of the things, however, that calling to Abram and having him travel as far as he did, and withholding his offspring so long, one of the things, of course, that does is it means that Abram and the ensuing Israelite nation, if we can call it that, will be small and not growing rapidly until they get to Egypt many years later. While everybody else is propagating and growing and establishing cities, Abram remains nomad. Isaac is, these are traveling guys, and their story with God keeps them from settling down, keeps them from prospering, keeps them from enlarging their peoples as fast as those around them. It's the same way that with the whole chain of the covenant, that God calls them to be different, and as a result, their lives are different. And that, of course, is what makes the record of the Bible so incredibly unique. You talk about the Gilgamesh epic, and you talk about the Enuma Elish and other creation and description of idols' origins. If you've ever read them, or if you ever read them, and then you read the account in Genesis about Moses, it's not just that there are differences in the gods we're talking about. There is a difference in the quality of the writing. There is definitely a sophistication to Moses compared to the primitive recordings of other nations in their descriptions. Their descriptions of things like creation are violent. Good is bad battle against evil. Who's going to win? And in the scriptures, it's very different from that. It's all about what God is doing. And so what they leave with us is an historical record that is beyond compare. The archaeologists poo-poo that, they say, well, they have to admit, even after all this time, archaeology still starts with the Bible. They just won't admit it because they don't want the Bible to be the last word. They want archaeology, they want to be in control of the historical record, and so they'll take their cue from the Bible, then they'll go and they'll dig up their pots and they'll say, see what I have? This proves the Bible wrong. And they can go home and have and enjoy the boasting that they've created. But there is nothing in the archaeological record that even compares to the writings of Scripture in terms of quality and in terms of detail and in terms of information. And without it, we would be lost. We wouldn't have much of a clue at all as to the peoples that we're talking about. When we talk about nations, we call these groups nations, and it's very hard to. Sometimes it's hard to get that transfer to what we call nations today. Nations were not nationalistic, meaning they didn't identify and protect their borders until the 15th century. And so what you would call a nation was simply a growing family of people that were occupying a particular place, protecting their turf as they saw it. But it's almost like if you were to draw the area in which the Hittites were, you color the map in, but it's not like, you can't, when you drive to Pennsylvania, and you see the side, welcome to Pennsylvania, that's a state line. Welcome to Maryland, that's a state line. There was no such thing as that. It all came down to the power and the control that they were able to exercise over their home turf. And until cities came along, even these nations were likely to be moving pillar to post. If it was a dry spell and the river was lower than usual, they would move on to someplace else they thought was better. And so it wasn't like, you had New York, where the Hittites were. It was just simply it was conducive to their needs and their abilities. So to call them nation is their corporate identity. Basically, their identity is with whoever's in charge, whoever's ruling at the time. That's why the names of these ancient Near East kings are so important, is because the nations look to them and say, okay, we are the nation of this person. And that, of course, means that the entire nation group is thrown into chaos when that man dies. They don't know who they are, they don't know where they belong, they don't know what's going on. Survival of all these people groups that we're talking about depends on advances in culture. We don't want to be invaded, so we want to protect ourselves. We want to survive, we want to feed our children. And we're looking for some way in which we can continue in some sense of comfort and lifestyle. You might remember Genesis 4:22. As soon as we hear the reading about Cain and Abel, there's advances in the one line about technology and all of this stuff. That isn't because a man was brilliant and all of a sudden he was inventing like crazy. These are things that you do when you have to survive. You build these things in. You construct your culture out of desperation, because otherwise you're going to dry up and die, or you might even get swallowed up. The tendency to travel, I've mentioned, depended on the conditions. That is, until the population grew to the point where they could provide for themselves in one place, where there could be some sense of buying and selling, where there could be some sense of trade, farmland, keeping of crops in one location, and all that. So the cities were late in coming because that meant that you didn't move. And so it had to be self-sustaining whenever those cities came along. So the archaeologists like to define these ages when they notice what tools they're being used and how the implements are being applied. They apply the various ages to what they find. Now, those ages are assigned by way of digging things up, which may or may not have a whole lot of credibility. Whenever parents die and the kids go and clean out the house, guess what they find? They find things 50, 60, 70 years back that they've been stored in the attic for all this time, and they finally just throw them away, right? Well, if you were an archaeologist and you were digging into the, what they're finding, that might really screw off their dating of what's going on, because it's just there was no automatic trash pickup. You just let things slide until you got rid of them, and so to date things is always precisely stated in the history books. It's not so in archaeology. It just isn't. To give you an idea, however, of where we are, we're basically talking about the period from 3000 BC. Forgive me for this changing the culture in such a form as this, but we're talking about 3,000 years before Christ to around 500 years before Christ. That's the gap. And most of that time, as you can see, was first assigned to the Bronze Age, and then the more and more they find, the more and more they have to be picayune about it, and so they assign, they've got early, middle, and late bronze, okay? And even that's not clear as mud. We're used to exact measurements in our society today. Give me the specific address of the house so I can put it in my GPS. We're used to that, but there's no measurements, there's no dates in any of this stuff. And as I explain in classes on evolution, these guys dig up a bone, they dig up a pottery piece, and they identify it as best they can. It says it looks similar to this, and that means, and I look at my calendar as to how it fits into my program, and they say, oh yeah, see, this must be 6 million years old. And the next thing you know, it's in the press. Archaeologist finds a 6 million old piece of pottery. It's all relative, and it's all pretty unspecific. But after the Bronze Age comes the Iron Age, and of course with the development of civilization, the development of more history, grasping of history, you do have more precise measurements in that. But in the period we're talking about, you always keep in mind, it is about a bit vague. So while there's no national borders, the use of government does follow. Before, when a group is wandering around, you just look to the strongest guy to be the one who calls the shots. But when you are establishing a city, a permanent city, now you are building things, now you are creating beauty, now you're creating art, now you're creating a sense of power, and so you have kings on thrones, literally, and the laws that they will establish will be things that will suit them. And that's an important aspect about this. They will want to utilize, they'll want to control the people. I want to build a tower. I'm Nimrod again. I want to build a tower to my great name, so I'm going to enslave half my people and force them into doing this. And so you increase your government in order to have access to manpower, taxes, labor, army, etc., as well as to simply serve the haves versus the have-nots. This is common. This is all common to mankind in general, but we want to keep that in mind when we think of all these different ones. The use of corporate religion eventually develops, becomes more sophisticated. Well, now that they're settled, now that they can build their towers, now that they can create their idols out of gold, because you have to have a metallurgist to do that. You have to have somebody who's not living in a tent. You have to have somebody who's got the equipment and who's got the position to do it. And now the royalty wants to embellish the religiosity of the people because that leaves them with control. It's all about control. So religion is developed in ancient Near East people groups for social control, not for personal belief. Superstition follows this. I was raised a Canaanite worshiping this crazy idol. Well, what happens if I ignore it? Well, maybe something bad will happen, and so you stay with the program. But there is no personal devotion or relationship to God, to an idol, because an idol is not reaching out to its people. It only wants to consume them. I read a factoid the other day. I don't know if it's true or not, but it sounds like it. That at the height of the Incas in South America, They were I think it said that they were in the habit of sacrificing 1% of their population every year, which was 250,000 people. And today, of course, that's anyway. So you would do whatever it took to to promote fear in your people. Think about how contrasting that is to Yahweh and his record. Controlling his people, consuming his people, and the priests are all about making that machine work and keeping the people in fear. And of course, idol worship is also always and in every form not only brutal, but immoral. Worship was, first of all, something to strike fear in your heart, and the next thing, of course, it was to titillate your lust, because both things control mankind. And so you would have sexual orgies in the name of this god, and you would have, and of course the sacrifices were only not some wino on the street, who cares about him? No, we're going to get a virgin, and we're going to see her on the altar. And so every form of immorality, every form of idolatry, even to this day, always have those same two characteristics: brutality and immorality. And that is also something that makes the Israelites stand out, as long as they adhere to the laws of Yahweh. But as soon as they want to slide back into the people groups, what happens to them? They become brutal and they become immoral. Those things don't ever change. The records that we have, the archaeological records that we have, are in three forms. There is a percentage of them that are royal records. These would be king's diaries. You remember the story of Esther. The king would dictate to his amanuensis, I had a nice day today. We enjoyed each other, and now I'm going to bed. See, Facebook, all over again. But they would also, of course, never want to do anything that would make them look vulnerable or less than perfect, and so nothing bad would ever happen to the king. It was always the glorious things. I remember my Old Testament professor at Westminster, reading one of these accounts. You might have even mentioned this, Nick. Reading one of these, it's a glorious description of how his army faced the battle and destroyed these people and burned these cities and everything else. Yeah, and my professor said, and that was the one he lost. They're going to paint the picture as gloriously as they can, but they lost. And think about how opposite the scriptures are. David shirks his duty, gets into real hot water. This king was bad. This king was good, according to his attention to Yahweh. This king died as a result of his immorality. The exposure of our sin is something that is there in the written record of Scripture, and you don't find that anywhere else. Because it's just not there. The vast majority of the records that we have are receipts. I had breakfast at Bob Evans yesterday, and they gave me a paper receipt. 90% of all we dig up are receipts, business receipts. Checklist of what we have to have before we go on vacation. Checklist of what George is going to buy. This is proof that George bought this. That's all it is just chatter. And that's, of course, what we have the most of. And so the archaeologists are studying this stuff. That's one reason why I never want to be an archaeologist.
Reading receipts.
And they're saying, aha, look at this. He paid $5 for a dozen eggs. That tells me X, Y, Z. Maybe he was just a dumb buyer. Whatever. But these archaeologists are rooting through the trash of previous people groups, because they're desperately trying to find something that justifies their preoccupation. But the last thing that we have in all of these people's records are their hero worship, and of course this is attaching the king to the gods. There's the mythology worship, and here again, here's the divine link to the king, and he's got to be portrayed in nothing but the strongest most virile terms you can imagine. And so you don't have any, mice gods. You have lions with human heads and wings and can't be stopped by anybody kind of thing. And that's all that's left. So archaeology is digging up things. That's the point. Archaeology spends its time digging up things because they're looking for the secrets that things will tell them. And so they will uncover the ruins of this nation. They'll uncover the ruins of this house. They'll uncover the ruins of this temple. They're digging for things because people leave things behind. Those same kings that want to build these monuments to their own name, they die. Their monuments either fall into disrepair or the stones are taken to build the next monument to the next king, and everything begins to deteriorate and everything begins to be covered with dust or is burnt over because this superior nation, sure enough, got overrun, and they or perhaps they tear it down. That was to Joe's father. Now we got to build a temple to Joe. So his father's temple's got to go. We got to build Joe's temple. And so they tear it down and they build on the same site oftentimes. And of course, if they're defeated and they're invaded by another nation's going to wipe out their monuments and build their own. But civilizations want to build to their own glory. That is, they're not thinking about future legacy. They just say, there's no one been as good as I am. I want my glory to be great. And that's, of course, that's a tendency in man that still is with us. But no matter how sophisticated their construction, no matter how much effort they make, they do become forgotten. They are buried in the dirt. Valley of the Kings is a very good example of that. They buried these kings with these Egyptian kings with pomp and ceremony and everything else, and then eventually they're all just covered in dirt and disappear. Nothing is left. Nothing is left. And that works for cultural traditions as well, creature comforts. When you live in a city, you start relaxing your survival efforts, you start enjoying life, you start partaking of the things that cities have, and so you're satisfying your materialistic needs as well as your emotional needs. And architecture becomes greater and greater. Now people can get full-time jobs designing buildings rather than herding the sheep out. And so they take advantage of that. And so the cultural traditions will change as a result of that. But again, the Bible is different. And this is a question, how do we know about these people? How is it that we are digging in dirt for receipts? Why are we doing this? The Bible's record is absolutely unique in the fact that the royal records, as I've said, boast of the nation, boast of what their mankind do. The Bible is unique in saying this is not about man, this is about what God's doing. The idols don't do anything in the ancient Near East, but God fills in. Says this is a record of what God has done, and so the biblical literature is filled with stories of people dealing with God and His commands, dealing with things that are sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes glorious, sometimes very despicable and wicked, but other times there is honor, and so the record that we have is not about. Solomon and the temple is an exception to this. David building Jerusalem is an exception. The rest of the history of Israel is not about building, it's about following God and stumbling in the process and getting at it. So it's filled with stories that are deliberately not painting the glory of man, but revealing the truth of our fallen nature, the effects of sin, the consequences of actions. All of that makes the biblical record unique. The reality of the might and the fury of neighbors is recorded accurately. The brutality of the nation cultures are depicted very clearly. God is personified just simply for His mercy and His grace, not because He is calling for 50 slaves this week. It makes it very, very different. George Grant writes about this, and I think this is very stunning here. He says, a society that has literature, a literature that lives and breathes with real live characters, not just kings, but ordinary people, is a society that has a soul. It's a society that lives as if people actually matter. You want to know why there are no stories in Mesopotamia? There are no stories in Mesopotamia because people don't matter. Money matters, progress matters, military exploits matters, governance and national security interests matter, but people, they don't matter. In the biblical narratives, people matter. We need to understand that this does not emerge by accident, simply by a good storyteller under a superintendence of the Holy Spirit. This is indicative of a radically different worldview. We need to see that the art, the music, the ideas, the literature, the fashion, the interests, the concerns of any given culture are direct reflections of what matters most. A society that cares more about money than people will look one way, and their literature will look another way. A society where people are a first import will have an entirely different kind of literature because they have an entirely different sort of worldview. That's how the Israelites differed from everybody else. So the Israelites did not leave monuments. They did build the temple. I wonder if the temple has been allowed to be destroyed by God, of God for 2,000 years because He doesn't want to be like the other nations. That is, it's stark in how that is so clearly depicted. Jesus comes along, He says, I'm going to tear this temple down. I'm going to replace it with the kingdom of God. That's not building a temple, that's building a church. The Israelites did not leave monuments, statues, and towers behind. They left their identity with the past. It's because we are Christians that we understand the past matters. Where we have been matters. And so, the study of archaeology was the impulse of a Christian world and life view. If it was not for the Bible telling us that history matters, we wouldn't have archaeologists out there digging in the dirt for receipts. They wouldn't care. In the world we live in, without the gospel, the past does not matter. How does that sound today? It's the same thing. The past doesn't matter to young people. The past is the past. Who cares about the past? We're about now. We're about what I'm going to do tomorrow. What happened yesterday? It's the Christian world and life view that says the past matters. So when Napoleon stared at the Sphinx and said, do you realize we're sitting on 5,000 years of history here? Probably the one good thing Napoleon ever did. Called his people to begin digging and discovering the past. If it hadn't been for a Christian world and life view, we would not even know about these nations. We wouldn't know anything about them because we're first introduced to them in the Bible, and then archaeologists have gone out and said, let's dig up these receipts. So it's the worldview that has made all the distinct difference. Now I'm going to talk about the Phoenicians. I'm supposed to have an hour on the Phoenicians. Forget it. The Phoenicians, I'm going to introduce them with a 10-minute video. I caught the ability to do that, so I'm going to show you a 10-minute video myself, which will tell you who the Phoenicians are, and they are unique, but they're later than some of the other ones. Hittites were ancient, 3,000 years. The Phoenicians really come along closer to 15 to 1800. That's kind of where they start to hit their stride, and I'm going to just say right off the bat that their primary enterprise was the use of the Mediterranean Sea. They were maritime sailors, traders. They built their lives and their cities and their livelihood on the boat. And they realized people will pay for this stuff. And they made a big deal about that. But the thing they leave us with was their alphabet. That's the most important thing that they left behind. You need an alphabet in order to communicate, in order to have trade, in order to make business. And so the Phoenician alphabet, for all intents and purposes, was the forerunner of the Greek alphabet, which of course is the forerunner of all Western language. So the Phoenicians in a very pragmatic way, established something that stayed with us for good. And so let's watch a little bit about the Phoenicians.
What does a vat of boiled carnivorous snails have to do with a 4,000-year-old extinct society? Turns out, quite a lot, actually. From around 1550 BCE to 300 BCE, the Phoenician Empire had a significant civilization built primarily on shipping trade throughout the Mediterranean. They established coastline cities that allowed their people to have a rich, enterprising maritime trade culture. They created waterways of business for many of the civilizations at the time, making it possible for someone from Greece or Rome to communicate and trade with people as far away as Britain. The Phoenicians didn't have a centralized location for their government. Perhaps the city-state of Tyre came closest to their established authority. As an alternative, like many ancient ruling powers, Phoenicians established independent city-states, a single city with surrounding dependent territories along the Mediterranean Sea. They used strategic city settings that allowed them a stronghold for maritime trade routes. Lebanon, Syria, and most of northern Israel, as we know them today, grew out of the Phoenician city-states. And the ancient city-state of Tyre is considered the most prominent Phoenician establishment, with over 30,000 citizens at its height of power. Phoenicians weren't interested in metal crafts, writing in scrolls, or art, unless it had something to do with shipbuilding. Their entire society grew around their understanding of the Mediterranean Sea. That means that if you wanted to set up a trade route over water in 1550 BCE, you had to use Phoenician ships to haul your goods. Because their homelands had rugged and virtually impassable overland topography, with narrow mountainous strips of impenetrable terrain, they had no choice but to use sea passages as a means to go around the rocky peninsulas. Phoenician shipbuilding was legendary, even for the Greeks. The neighbors praised their seamanship, and writers like Herodotus and Homer scribed their admiration for Phoenician sailing vessels. The shipbuilders created battering rams on bows and invented the keel, bottom-most longitudinal structure on most ships. They created caulk, specifically designed to seal wood plank hulls and keep out seawater. According to Assyrian relief carvings, even passages in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, we know the Phoenicians designed the perfect vessel for the right reasons. They had 3 major ship types. Each served particular functions for their trade routes. All Phoenician vessels had shallow keels. They used oars and masted square sails. Each ship had decks and rams on the bow. They built warships in case pirates wanted to raid their cargo ships. The cargo ships had big-bellied hulls, allowing for maximum capacity for freight. These ships had reinforced hulls and convex sterns and bows. They had capacities upward of 450 tons. Sometimes cargo fleets had over 50 boats, escorted by the warships. The third design was a smaller version of the cargo vessel with a horse head and a single bank of oars. It was primarily used for short trips and some fishing excursions. It wasn't just traveling between settlements that made their ships impressive. It was the craftsmanship that went into the cargo vessels. Phoenician shipbuilders understood to make the most of any trip, they had to design vessels that not only negotiated around the mountainous coastlines, but also had to carry a lot of stuff to make it worth the trip. Phoenician cargo vessels hauled anything and everything, from people to pottery, precious metals, and ingots of copper, to one of their most famous inventions. We'll get to that in a bit. Phoenicians built world-class cargo ships, but they didn't use navigation instruments. Instead, they used the iconic coastline markers and natural features for navigational points. Their boats were as durable as their sailors, who used the stars and dead reckoning for finding their way to the next trading post. Eventually, sailors adopted important nautical inventions to allow them further avenues for trade. The Phoenicians became so proficient at sailing, they began expanding their trade routes beyond the safety of traditional Mediterranean navigating. Before their civilization dissolved, the Phoenicians took their hardy vessels beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Strait of Gibraltar, and breached the Atlantic Ocean. They even got as far as Britain and Mesopotamian seaports. It was the Phoenician trade routes that established their prominence throughout the civilized world at the time. For nearly 1,250 years, the Phoenicians thrived as a significant part of the Bronze Age. They had it all: the best ships, the best sailors, trade routes, and shipping anything and everything to the neighboring people. So, what happened? The Phoenicians went without major shipping competition for a long time. Sometimes, when more prominent societies think there's a better way of doing things, they adapt the customs, or they take it all by force. The Phoenicians' reign in the Mediterranean ended, not because they lacked commodity, but because they were sailors, traders, and not born conquerors. The beginning of the end of the Phoenicians happened when a guy with a big ego and a lot of time on his hands decided to march his troops into the cities of Sidon and Byblos in 332 BCE. That man was Alexander the Great. Both city-states were established by Phoenicia and submitted peacefully to Alexander's demands. When he eventually took his troops to the city of Tyre, that's when the Phoenician leaders decided they weren't interested in Alexander's offer of sacrifice in Tyre's holy temple of Melkart. According to Phoenician religious practices, outsiders weren't allowed to give sacrificial tributes to Tyre gods. Being a reasonable diplomat who understood the importance of having allies in troubling times, Alexander sent an envoy into the walled city to negotiate some sensibility when it came to religious rights and submission to the mighty conqueror. Local government officials of Tyre wanted no part of Alexander's envoy for negotiating a surrender. They sent a bold message to Alexander the Great by slaughtering his representatives and throwing their bodies over the city wall. Since Alexander the Great wasn't one to take no for an answer, he decided to make an example of the mighty city holding 30,000 residents. He ordered the siege of Tyre. His troops erected a causeway built of debris, felled trees, and city ruins to breach Tyre's stronghold. After 7 months, Alexander the Great finally made it into the city proper. Immediately, he parleyed with the wealthiest of the citizens for their passage out of the Phoenician city with their lives, minus their cash. The rest of the people were massacred or forced into slavery. Once Tyre fell to Alexander, other Phoenician city-states submitted to his rule. The Phoenician civilization ended, and the Hellenistic age began. By 64 BCE, anything left of the original Phoenicia city-states was annexed and turned into the colonies for the Roman Empire. So, what was it about the predatory sea snails that was so important to the Phoenicians? Around 1570 BCE, while boiling a species of Mediterranean rock snails named murex, they found the snail secreted a vivid purple dye. The color today is called Tyrian purple, and even in ancient times, it was highly prized. Phoenician purple wasn't easy to make. It took substantial harvests and tens of thousands of snails to brew a vat of imperial dye. For the intense labor and the incomparable and dazzling richness of the purple color, it became highly sought after. The Phoenicians used their maritime trading routes to network the fabric dye that was controlled, because everyone wanted a piece of the action. Different marine gastropods gave off variations of purple, but it was the murex that gave off the treasured purple hue. At one point during the height of snail harvest and dye manufacturing, 4th century historian Theopompus said, "Purple for dyes fetched its weight in silver."
This is Tyre today, the remnants of that very prominent Phoenician city. That and Byblos were probably the two biggest ones. This is from Sidon, and the marketplace. It's a hippodrome. That's what that is. They had races.
Chariots, right?
Yeah. So the bleachers are over here, and the racetrack is in the middle. When it comes to significant interactions with the Scriptures and with God's people, there are several things to mention. I'm just going to hit some highlights. In the Old Testament, the materials for the temple were supplied by Hiram of Tyre, and so Solomon, actually David before him, had gotten along real well with Hiram because he was building his temple, he was building his house, had to be lined with cedar. He was, building up Jerusalem, it's a capital city, and so the port business of the Phoenicians came in real handy. when David died and Solomon went to build the temple, Hiram was right there. You remember he sent his best architects and builders, and so the two got along great. There was always something good about their arrangement. They scratched each other's back, and it was very profitable for the Phoenicians. By the time you get to the divided kingdom with King Ahab, you had him marrying a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. Imagine you naming your kid Jezebel. I mean, she must have been an ugly infant. Jezebel. Anyway, you remember the story in 1 Kings 16 that she came with her Baal worship. She came with her priests. She came with her entourage, kind of like Mary Queen of Scots insisted on being Catholic in the Protestant nation of Scotland. You know, she insisted on Baal worship, and of course, if the queen wants Baal worship, the queen gets Baal worship, and before you know it, if the royalty is into Baal, then we want to be in with the royalty, so we're going to worship Baal too. And before you know it, Baal worship took over Israel, and that led to the climactic confrontation with the prophet Elijah, who, you remember, complained to God, "I'm the only one left." It was that obvious when he looked around Israel that it had been sold out for Baal. He said, "I'm the only one left." And, of course, God very encouragingly said, "Nah, you're really not. There's lots of guys who are sitting on their hands waiting for a leader like you, and you're going to turn them on." And that led to the confrontation on Mount Carmel. You remember, that was in direct, in your face to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians went on to be just who they were. They were materialistic, enterprising, manipulating, they were just hard-nosed businessmen, and that always, leads to an abandonment of consideration for others. So the prophets cursed the Phoenicians, not only because of who the Phoenicians were, but because the Israelites were continuing to work with them, because of the business and the profit that was there, and of course the influence that the Phoenicians continued to have on Israel. God was saying, take your stand, be unique in the world as you're called to be. And I said, no, we're going to kind of be like the Phoenicians. We're going to hang out with them. And that eventually boiled down to the condemnations by Ezekiel and Joel and Amos and Zechariah. They all talked down the Phoenicians and their effect on us. You're letting your daughter date a Phoenician. What's the matter with you? It's the pollution of the mind that we're talking about. The pollution of the heart, drawing my people away that made the prophets so angry. So by the time you get to the New Testament, the Phoenicians are taken over. Alexander the Great has wiped them out. But now the whole area is Roman. Rome is also into big business on the Mediterranean. You remember the Roman Empire surrounded the Mediterranean and took over the Phoenician city of Carthage. The story of Carthage's fall was a big deal. That city was started by the Phoenicians and had become rich and powerful by the Phoenicians, and that was really their last fall, was when Carthage fell. But the business attitude, the hard-nosed, materialistic, idol manipulating, cruelty with that, and the immorality that went with it, was the reason why Jesus himself condemned Tyre and Sidon in the ways that he did. You might remember in Matthew 11, he says, he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, but they did not repent, cities in Israel. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Your mind goes to Jonah and Nineveh and how they repented. It said, and if Tyre and Sidon had heard this, they would have repented. You are not even there. I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. It's a wretched thought. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works had been in you in Sodom, he's going farther, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you that it would be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. The covenant works both ways, folks. It's a unique blessing to God's people, providing for them in every way, shape, and form through a relationship with the living and true God. But to walk away from that is worse than being pagan. It is the judgment of God for rejecting the covenant. That also continues to this day. When Tyre and Sidon continue to woo our young people away or our husbands away, it's going to be worse for them. That's the lesson Jesus is teaching us there. Okay, any questions about Phoenicia? Yes?
Are the Phoenicians considered Semitic peoples?
I don't know for sure, but I assume so,
They have
yeah.
a Semitic
Yeah.
alphabet.
Yeah. Yeah, all of these folks were Semitic by descent. Yes?
I was wondering if the Baals are unique to Phoenicia, or if that was
No.
Phoenicia that other people worship.
Yeah. Again, Baal worship was a manipulating idol, and so it became pretty common. Yes?
So I looked in the Bible, and Canaan, who you said was Semitic, he's descended from Ham.
Right.
But so I think isn't Semitic broken up in like two categories, like descended from Shem and also Semitic language, because the language is just we say it's Semitic because the Jews are descended from Shem, and the Jews' language is like these other languages, so we lump them.
Yeah.
But like they're not really descended from. A lot of these people were not descended from Shem.
The business of ancient language study is a very mysterious one. It's not easy to pin down the roots of even Semitic language groups. It's not an exact science by any means. But you remember, that you're right that Canaan, the son of Ham, went south. Essentially went south. The sons of Shem, or the family groups descending from Shem, went east. So when we study the archaeological evidence of all of these, we find the same Semitic roots to the language that goes back, and so we can assume that it goes back to the descendants of Shem, but it's not precise by any means.
The original patriarch probably wasn't.
No. That happened at Babel, with the confusion of the languages to the point where it wasn't comfortable to. The reversal of Babel was the Phoenician alphabet, because that was their attempt to let's everybody speak English. Same kind of deal. Yeah, Kurt.
There's been intermixing between Semites and Japhethites and Hamites from the beginning, just because the different groups just migrate back and forth, depending on how good the weather is,
Right.
whether they can find food. For example, in the New Testament times, Gauls were in the north of Turkey,
Moved.
as well as in France.
Right.
So some of them had moved back and forth, depending on, are we having a small ice age here? We can't
Right.
live here. We'll have to go back down here.
Right, and so archaeology is paired with language study, but neither of them can say this is exactly what the tracings went to. It was a language that held the ancient people together first. We can at least communicate, and then civilizations built on that similarity. Yeah, Dan?
In terms of reading about the Phoenicians in the Bible, and you saw this in the New Testament scriptures, but they don't call them Phoenicians, right? It's mostly Tyre and Sidon that you read about. I don't know.
Or in the Bible, they're called Canaanites.
Yeah, they're listed with the Canaanites. I can't answer that question with precision. The people, by the time of Jesus, the Phoenicians weren't around anymore.
But I'm thinking more of the Old Testament.
Well, when Othniel went, and went against the Canaanites, they were the Phoenicians. They were all the same.
They probably didn't call themselves that, you're right. As you saw in the video, Phoenicians, the name Phoenicia was that purple dye. And so, they just started labeling the people who provided them with purple dye were the Phoenicians, the purple dye people. Pizza guy. Oh, purple dye guy, okay. What do you mean it costs this much? Purple guy, yeah, it's gone up, I'm sorry, inflation.